The member for Indi has the call.
Madam Speaker, I rise on this very important issue regarding the adverse impacts that the carbon tax is having on jobs and manufacturing. And what compounds the damage that the carbon tax has caused on Australian jobs is the fact that the government has ignored warnings. We had last year in February, we had the CEO of Penrice Soda say that the carbon tax, if it's implemented the way it is intended to be, could be the death knell for a lot of Australian industry. From this year, Penrice will pay $8 million in carbon tax and Adelaide Brighton $80 million, one of our big clients. The timing of it is excruciatingly poor. But this government didn't listen to the very basic logic. And the logic is this: if you impose a tax on Australian energy intended to increase the price of energy, increase the price of electricity, it makes conducting business in Australia more expensive. It means running hospitals becomes more expensive. It means manufacturing operations are more expensive. And why? Let's remember why. It was not to reduce emissions. It was not for some environmental benefit, because as we know, when Australian businesses go offshore, we are exporting our emissions offshore to nations that don't have the same clean, green production processes and regulations as we do. So what happens is they will make the same things we used to make, but create more emissions in the process. So it's a lose-lose. And we know from the government's own modelling that the carbon tax is intended to cut production in key areas. We see their own modelling shows that aluminium production is supposed to fall by 61.7%, that alumina production is supposed to fall by 44.1%, iron and steel production by over 21%. And what that is telling you is, with the fall in production, necessarily there is a fall in jobs in those industries that are directly affected by the carbon tax, because in the manufacturing sector, those businesses that compete with imports are put at a competitive disadvantage. It's a very simple thing to understand. When you put the cost up of making something in Australia and an import comes in that competes with an Australian-made product, that import, that obviously doesn't have a carbon tax imposed upon it, is even cheaper than it would have been. Now let's take our exports, because manufacturing contributes to 29% of our exports. Our exports in manufacturing are also put at a competitive disadvantage when they are competing with goods overseas that don't have the high costs of production that we have. The government is in pure denial. Pure denial because there is the lack of maturity to make a very simple statement: we got it wrong. The Prime Minister is not big enough to say she got it wrong in choosing the Greens over Australian workers. She got it wrong in caving in, showing poor judgment. It wasn't very tough then, was it? No woman of iron then, no tough cookie then. In standing up to the Greens, she could have thrown the Greens a bit of a carrot. They would have still supported her, but no. The Prime Minister, which will arguably, and there's a lot of competition for this, arguably go down as her worst judgment call ever, chose the Greens and this ridiculous job-destroying policy over Australian workers. For what? For what? Not to reduce emissions, but desperately to try and cling on to power. And over this year alone, let's look at some of those businesses. We've seen in March, CSR announced the loss of 150 jobs at Ingleburn, with its managing director later confirming that the carbon tax had added around $500,000 to the annual costs at the Ingleburn facility. We've had in February, Amcor announcing over 300 jobs lost across the country, many in Brisbane and also in the Prime Minister's own electorate. And what did the company say at the time? It cited significant cost increases, including energy, as being one of a series of factors that had a significant impact on their ability to remain competitive. And that's what it's about. The Prime Minister may think that costs in relation to a business operation is a boring topic, but it's a basic fact. If a business cannot keep its costs under control, it will not remain competitive. It is not a charity. It must make a profit in order to employ people, and increasingly we are seeing in the manufacturing sector this is becoming more and more difficult. And yes, there are. Yes, there are significant international challenges. We know that. We know that there are challenges there, but why on earth, in that environment, would any government ignore those challenges and sometimes use them as a crutch to absolve themselves of their poor policy, of their job-destroying policy, of the economic sabotage that the carbon tax is at a time when we can least afford it? And we heard, and it's interesting because often you get the response from government, it's either the minister or the minister's spokesman. It's interesting in this area of industry policy and manufacturing policy, when things get a bit too tough, ministers are too afraid to front up to the media to actually pursue their argument. They send out a spokesman. And one of the things they invariably rely on is the high Australian dollar. So that's their crutch. It's not the carbon tax. It's not the carbon. In fact, it's this perverse Orwellian language, as if the carbon tax is great. Well, if it's so great, they should have had it at a higher rate. It would have created more jobs. But they know in their heart of hearts that is absolutely absurd. So when they rely on the high dollar, not only are they not being totally upfront with Australian workers, but they are insulting. They are insulting those businesses that are trying to remain competitive in order that they are able to continue to employ Australians. And Rob Sindel, CSR's Managing Director, said only the other day that it's just too easy for people to say it's just the Australian dollar. And this is a company that, of course, has experienced job losses recently. But what we see is continued evidence from business, from industry groups, telling government that the cost of making things in Australia, the barrier to investment, the barrier to growth, are increasing costs, of which energy costs, important input costs, are an increasing barrier to that increased growth and investment. And we have Greg Evans from the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry say the lack of pricing power and the inability to pass on cost increases, such as the effect of the carbon tax, has dented small business profits and its ability to employ and expand. But of course, the Prime Minister, Minister for Industry are totally and utterly deaf to that, because to accept that would mean accepting responsibility, a very grown-up thing that unfortunately for this nation and the workers of this nation, this government is incapable of doing. We have seen a record number of companies go into liquidation. We saw the reports in the media on Monday, over 10,500. The government just brushed that aside. We've heard, and we heard in relation to that from insolvency practitioners, that the carbon tax for many of these companies was the last straw. We heard that it was like pulling a leg from under a chair. And what does the government do in response? They say, oh, well, you're all pretending. You're all pretending, because really jobs have gone up. And they quoted the other week some figures from the ABS. And according to media reports, the ABS briefed the government on labour force gains for February 2013 and warned them. This is according to media reports. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with the update of job figures next month. They were briefed that the figures would be overstated, most likely by a factor of 2. But, of course, this didn't stop the Treasurer and the Prime Minister boasting about all these jobs, even though they had, it's reported, they'd been briefed that the figures would be overstated. So the Labor Party should stop the spin and tell the truth, because out there, not just in the suburbs of Western Sydney, but in the regional towns and centres of this country, in the manufacturing centres of our capital cities, people are seeing Australian jobs disappear. For every large listed company that records and has its jobs losses reported in the newspapers, there are dozens. There are dozens of other small and medium-sized businesses whose job losses go unreported, but they are felt as deeply in those families that lose their livelihood. And why? Only because this government is incapable of owning up to the fact that the greatest economic sabotage inflicted on the Australian economy has been the carbon tax. We even see the impact of the carbon tax on the auto sector, and the Labor Party likes to pretend to promise the industry the earth, the moon and the stars, and there's a lot of delicacy and sensitivity on the other side, because what they did at the last election, was promise the industry whatever they needed to get over the line. And what did we see after the election? Not only did the Prime Minister break her promise not to introduce a carbon tax and imposed $460 million increased costs on Australian manufacturing, but they also broke $1.4 billion worth of their promises to the auto sector. So what this government, what this party is saying, the Labor Party is saying, we will tell you whatever you want to hear, we will promise you anything you want up until the election, and afterwards we will do the exact opposite. And we've seen so much of the discussion about the auto sector is around the components sector, and we've seen the Chief Executive of the Federation of Automotive Products Manufacturers say, we're going to be impacted by a carbon tax and our competitors overseas won't be. So in a very challenging environment, this government is saying, well, that's too bad. We even see for the large companies that were awarded compensation, and in the words of Graham Cray from BlueScope, any compensation is like a Band-Aid over a bullet wound, because, let's face it, you can never totally compensate for the damage that you have caused, and that is at least the so-called compensation was admission of the damage that the carbon tax would cause. But even for these large companies, they need to make decisions for when the so-called compensation runs out. Companies don't make decisions for a 3-year period. They look to the long term, particularly when they're looking at significant investments. But what about all those businesses that don't even get the pretence of a look-in with any compensation? They are left there to accept the additional burden, and you will have the Labor Party tell you, oh, but we've given all this money, we've given all this free money to households so they can afford the increased costs, increased energy costs. But what they fail to ignore and accept the reality is that so many of our products made in Australia are being replaced by cheaper imports that are given a kickstart, a head start, because they do not have the additional cost imposed upon them of increased electricity and energy charges, because they come from countries, unlike Australia, that do not subject their manufacturers to the world's largest carbon tax. The reality is, Mr Deputy Speaker, that there is great concern about job security in this country, particularly across manufacturing, where there have been 109,000 jobs lost in the manufacturing sector since this party came to power. They can get up here and come to the dispatch box and pretend that the reality is something else, but workers out there and their families know the damage that is being done because they are losing their jobs, their friends are losing their jobs. Manufacturers have come together in a new organisation called Manufacturing Australia to ensure that their voice is heard because they want to continue to have viable businesses, they want to continue to have a viable future, and there is every reason that we can have that viable future. The first and simple step is to remove damaging government policies like the carbon tax that are intended to slug and slow down the production of our manufacturing sector.